I'm Carrie Bourne. I'm from the Office of Continuing Education at UW-Whitewater. We host the Fairhaven Lecture Series each semester, and we schedule 10 to 12 lectures on a theme, and we discuss that theme throughout the semester. And this fall, we're discussing World War I. It's been 100 years since the U.S. entered World War I, so we thought we would take that opportunity to go over lots of different topics relating to World War I. Today's topic should be fascinating and something we haven't had as part of our series yet, so we're looking forward to it. I'll introduce today's speaker. John McGuigan is Professor of English and Film Studies at UW-Whitewater, where he has taught 19th and 20th century British literature since 2004. He has published articles on James Joyce, Virginia Woolf, Juna Barnes, and on the American poet E.E. Cummings' World War I memoir, The Enormous Room. He also studies film adaptation and has published on the adaptation of Black Hawk Down, which recounts the experience of U.S. Army Rangers in Somalia. Please welcome John McGuigan.
So I'm really honored that you're all here. Thank you so much for coming. No, it is. My students are always in class under protest, it feels like sometimes. So it's nice to have you all here and on time, too, which is good. So I called my talk today To Do and Die, World War I Poetry and the End of Victorian Progress. And when I think about World War I poetry and what's unique and exciting about it, especially in the British context, which is mostly what I'll talk about today, I think it is the break with the past in the way that World War I was such a radical change in the way warfare was conducted, and because of that, it was a radical change in the experience of the soldiers fighting in it and the soldiers who wrote about it. And I think the way that came across, particularly in poetry, had profound effects on British culture at the time, and I think one of the domino effects of that is the effect it has on American culture and the way that war has been portrayed really ever since. And so I want to walk you through a few of the things that I think about it. You might recognize some of the poems that we talk about. This is a very popular poem, and even today when I teach it, students really enjoy it, and it's often one of the few they've heard of. The Charge of the Light Brigade by Lord Alfred Tennyson was published in 1852, I believe, but he's kind of often considered the quintessential Victorian artist. If you had to pick just one artist to represent the 19th century tradition in British literature, I think I would pick Tennyson. All right, so I just highlighted a couple key stanzas. Forward the light brigade, was there a man dismayed? Not though the soldier knew someone had blundered. Theirs not to make reply, theirs not to reason why, theirs but to do and die. Into the valley of death rode the 600. And if you know this poem, a lot of these lines get repeated over and over again. But this is one I remember vividly from high school because my high school teacher loved it. And he always took great pains to point out, as my title of the talk does, that it's not theirs to do or die, it's theirs to do and die. That there's not a choice. That implied in their decision to follow their orders, even though they knew someone had blundered, that they do it anyways, all right? Into the valley of death rode the 600. And so this poem it's about a battle in the Crimean War where the British Army, there was a mixed message and a unit of light cavalry, which means they were unarmored, rode into a valley that was well covered with cannon, and most of them were killed. And so Tennyson wrote this to celebrate the bravery of following the order and going into this battle, even though they knew it would lead to their death. And so he concludes the poem, when can their glory fade? Oh, the wild charge they made. All the world wondered. Honor the charge they made. Honor the light brigade. Noble 600. Okay. So in that last, this is what I would ask my students, in that last stanza, what are some of the words that stand out as being significant or important? Which ones catch your attention as you hear that? When can their glory fade? Oh, the wild charge they made. Honor the light brigade, the noble 600. Any words jump out as being significant? Glory, yep, definitely. What else? Honor, the wild charge, right? That kind of reckless courage. Noble, yeah, those are some of the big ones. So I think what I wanted to draw your attention to here is the way that poetry in the 19th century, when it wrote about war, typically, I would say, celebrated the martial values, right? The values of the soldier that are still celebrated today, right? Courage. They follow the orders, though they know that it means certain death. Discipline, right? They have the self-control, the self-discipline to ride into the face of cannon. Honor, glory, nobility, those words that Tennyson uses at the end of the poem there. And even into World War I, those continued to be popular values. And I would say today still in culture and certainly in military recruiting, right? Those are the honors that are evoked and celebrated still. So here you have a recruiting poster from World War I. And you see the British cavalry, the British horse charging in, and every fit Briton, it's a little tongue twister there, should join our brave men at the front, enlist now. Okay, so these values are, I think historically art always kind of celebrated these values, and one of the effects was that it tended to be in service of whatever the national interest was or whatever the national agenda was. Okay. All right, and I think built into this Victorian mindset is something we can think of as the doctrine of progress, and that is for the British person of, I would say even up until the start of World War I, all of history they felt had been leading towards where Britain stood, in the 19-teens at really the pinnacle of world power. I forget, like something of 20% of the Earth's surface they had some sort of administrative control over at that point in time. So they were at the peak of power, and they saw all of history as sort of leading to them being at the forefront of that. So you can think of Victorian progress, what I put in my title, as that belief that humanity is always improving, that civilization is continually reaching new heights, and that Britain is at the forefront of that it's kind of their duty to the world, their duty to humanity to sort of spread this civilization. And implied in that is that it's going to keep going in that direction. And if you want to think of some of the backgrounds of that, you can think of the way that science and industry change in the 1800s in Britain, right? You go in 1700 from a largely rural agrarian society to, by 1900, industry more or less as we know it. The developments in science, all of that sort of led them to believe that humans were continually improving, learning more, doing more, becoming more civilized. There was also a religious overtone to it, right? That it was a sign of God's approval of Britain, that they were so successful militarily, successful economically, that God was smiling on them. It was actually also connected to ideas of evolution, all right? That Britain, at this point, was the most evolved, form of humanity at this point. And it was also tied to ideas of democracy and self-governance that had really only developed starting in the late 1700s. Any questions so far or comments? Am I getting quiet? All right. Here's a favorite poem that I like to read my students to kind of capture this late Victorian spirit. And this is by a man named Henry Newbolt, who was knighted in 1915 in the midst of Britain's involvement in the war. And coincidentally, he worked in the propaganda department for the War Department during World War I. So I'll just read it for you. There's a breathless hush in the close tonight, 10 to make and the match to win. I think that's a cricket reference, if I'm not mistaken. A bumping pitch and a blinding light, an hour to play and the last man in. It's not for the sake of a ribboned coat or the selfish hope of a season's fame, but his captain's hand on his shoulder smote, play up, and play the game. So you have that kind of schoolyard sports imagery. The sand of the desert is sodden red, red with the wreck of a square that broke, the Gatlings jammed and the colonel dead, and the regiment blind with dust and smoke. The river of death has brimmed his banks, and England's far, and honor a name. But the voice of a schoolboy rallies the ranks, play up, and play the game. This is the word that year by year, while in her place the school is set, every one of her sons must hear, and none that hears it dare forget. This they all with joyful mind bear through life like a torch in flame, and falling fling to the host behind, play up, and play the game. So in this poem, I just wanted to get the title back up there. He's using the imagery of team sports, all right, and either the rugby or the cricket team, and sort of the camaraderie that's built on the sports field as a metaphor for the kind of values that will serve the soldiers well as they head off to war. So there's that kind of belief that, again, it has to do, I think, with this idea that that in British culture they imagine that the shared national values are the same ones that will serve to progress and serve to further all of their goals and their aims. Yeah. Yep. Yeah, exactly. Right. So the class division between officers and enlisted men is, I think, even more stark in the British Army and even more stark at this point in time than it was then. So, these were poems written by the officer class for the officer class, and that, encouraging your mates to play up and play the game is what an officer needs to do to inspire those that he's working for or who are serving under him. Yeah. And another element that I wanted to highlight in this one is the idea that that these values, that these attitudes are a legacy that every generation must hand on to the next. So the title of the poem is Latin for the torch of life, and the idea is that each generation has to pass on the torch to the next, right? And so the officer, who inspires his men is also an inspiration for the next generation of schoolboys who will be the next generation of officers. Yeah, it was. Right. Not unheard of, but uncommon at the time, right? That there weren't very many. Yep, I'm going to get to that too. All right. Any other questions or comments about this? So I bring this up because this is the mindset that these officers are heading into World War I with. Okay, right? They're expecting the charge of the Light Brigade. They're expecting to rally their men with the spirit of sport, right? And instead, as you probably, if you've been to the other lectures, they'll find something else. So this is, I like this enlistment poster because I think it kind of captures a whole bunch of British values just in the picture. And isn't this worth fighting for? So the importance of a notion of hearth and home, of what you're fighting for, and then also the romantic notions of the English countryside. All right. This, yeah. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Well, that's the critique that the war poets will make, yeah, or the ones that I'm going to talk more about. Yeah, I agree. So instead of the English landscape here, this is the landscape they encounter, right? The first warfare where you have this kind of mass destruction of civilian landscape. So this is presumably later in the war, but so what was different about World War I? I don't know if other speakers have spoke to this, but I'll just give you the brief non-historian rundown. Glad not to see no history professors here to be bothered by my oversimplification. It's really the first war where you have the mass use of mechanized warfare. Machine guns, as someone pointed out, the tank. No, that's not my first picture. It's the first use of airplanes in warfare, and the size of the artillery is something that really had never been seen before. So this is a picture of an American. They called them rail guns because they were on train tracks, but you can see just by the people how massive it is. And then here's an early French tank. Okay, so because of the scale of the mechanization, right, you had a level of destruction that had never really been seen before, and it was a level of destruction that I always kind of think of it as being superhuman, if you don't take that in kind of the comic book version of it, but a level of destruction that the human being isn't capable of alone, right? That it happens in numbers, it happens on a scale that, you know, human power isn't capable of by itself. So just a few other points about this trench-style warfare, that it was total war, that involved civilian populations in ways that it hadn't before, both in terms of levels of enlistment, the extreme measures that had to be taken in the war production effort, but also in terms of the battlefield too, and how completely things and people were affected by this. So just a few facts that I always think are interesting. In Britain, of roughly 40 million Britons at the time, 6 million men were mobilized, which, so if you start to think of, you know, half the population is men, and then if you take out the children, if you take out the elderly, the percentage of men that went is pretty massive. It's a massive percentage, right? And of those who went, the casualty rates were very high. Over 10% were killed. More than half were injured in some form. All right. And I think I saved it for later, but so there's that massive effect on the population at whole, but another characteristic that was influential was the idea that units in the army were organized by their town, by their location. And so if you had a unit from a town that was in one of the particularly horrific battles where, where 70, 80% were being killed, if you think of it, an entire generation from that town is almost gone. And I think that was something that had a particularly lasting, scarring effect on the public psyche, if you want to think of it that way. The war as a whole, there were just massive numbers of deaths. It was reading statistics of 17 million people killed if on all sides through the course of the war. And I put days of slaughter in that there were certain battles that were particularly brutal, and one of the more famous ones is the Battle of the Somme, which over, I didn't do my math before I came, 7 to 4 or 5 months. In 1916, between the Germans and the French and the English, or the British, 1.2 million soldiers killed just in that one campaign. 20,000 alone killed on the first day of that battle, which I think still ranks as one of the deadliest days in history as far as warfare. Here's where I had by town. So this was just on the right there. So the newspapers would publish every day rolls of who was killed, who was wounded, and they would update previous releases, and that was largely how people would learn of the fate of their family members and friends. And so something else that's unique about World War I think, is the public consciousness of the war. It was the first war that was widely photographed. There are early films of war, although a lot of them were staged afterwards, a lot of the ones you would find. And the way that the newspapers covered it with the casualty rolls was influential in that people at home were much more aware of what was going on, probably more aware of the brutality of what was going on than they would have been in previous generations. To be honest, I'm not sure. I mean, I think, just thinking of the fiction I've read of the time, that often it seems like family members would read something in the paper sooner than they would be officially notified. Does anyone happen to know? I'm wondering if there's some war buffs who might know. No, I'm not really sure. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Right, and so I think that has a different effect on the public consciousness and a different effect on public attitudes towards war than when you hear about it through means that are further removed from the reality of it. Yeah. I just love these black and white photos. I don't know why, but all right. So I wanted to talk just a little bit about the propaganda, but in particular how the propaganda contrasts with what people found when they were actually there, right? So if you think back to the poem that I read about, playing the game, right? This was one of the propaganda posters that tries to evoke that team spirit. And again, it's oriented towards the officer class, right, who would play these sports. All right. And that's just such that photograph's amazing to me. You can see the landscape, just the devastation that in a former forest, right? There's no tree, there's no trees living, there's very little vegetation anymore. It's largely just mud. This one I like too because it's kind of evoking that spirit of camaraderie that, it is indeed strong. Camaraderie is, one of the strongest feelings a soldier experiences, and here the propaganda is trying to evoke that, right? That you can come. You even have the one guy kind of motioning you to jump on the train with us, right? That you can come be one of the team. You have the older gentleman in the corner, sort of waving his hat, right? Saluting him. Way to go. But I just find this an especially gruesome picture that living in the mud holes, you can see the various soldiers, how they were spending their time. So, what were some of the effects in art, and how did we see that? How do we see that expressed in poetry, and I picked just a few paintings to help visualize it. There's an emphasis on fragmentation, and so you have this etching where you have so if the few things I would talk about here is that they're supposed to be soldiers, right? And those weird football looking things are actually the British helmets, kind of seen from an angle, right? Their heads as they're walking left to right on the painting. And so you have the sharp angles, the contrasts of black and white, and it's not particularly warm or inviting. It's not organic, right? There's nothing natural about the lines or the images or the colors in this. And this is another color painting of soldiers at rest. You can see the helmets down towards the bottom. Ooh, there is a pointer, sweet. You can see the helmets tilted at the angle that sort of look like the last one. So so you have that emphasis on fragmentation. Another thing that you'll see, especially in some of the more widely read war poets, is the attempt to shock people. Okay, the pictures were shocking to people, but they were also censored and controlled to some degree. So the poets were often made an effort to bring out the shocking material. So this is from a poem called "Dead Man's Dump" by Isaac Rosenberg, who was a British officer, and he was killed in April of 1918. And this is just a section from the middle. A man's brain splattered on a stretcher bearer's face. His shook shoulders slipped their load, but when they bent to look again, the drowning soul was sunk too deep for human tenderness. They left this dead with the, it's supposed to be other dead, stretched at the crossroads. Okay, so in this one, what are some of the words and images that jump out at you, that catch your attention right away? Splattered, right? Yep. How far away from Tennyson are we with splattered, right? Other images? He was, yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I'm not sure how he got to be an officer. His father or his parents were, middle-class merchants, and he actually joined strictly to help his mom, to support his mother for the payments, right? And so she could have some kind of pension from his participation, right? So his feelings in joining were not strictly patriotic, right? Mm-hmm. So to emphasize the brutality, you have the images, but also the if you think of the word choices and how they sound, just some of these poets are really good about bringing out kind of the rough, guttural sounds, right? Splattered, you have the T's and the D's. Shook shoulders slipped, you have that kind of hissing and the SH sound. The drowning soul sounds kind of watery, right? So in this coarse and common use of language, all right, there was a way that these poets were kind of undermining what people expected poetry to be, right? I think poetry at the time, they would have expected something high-minded, something beautiful, right? And instead you had a lot of poets purposely tried to undercut that expectation. And with it, to undercut the values that I had talked about earlier. So here's a poem from probably my personal favorite, Wilfred Owen, called "Anthem for Doomed Youth." What passing? So think think not only about kind of the harsh and common language that he uses, but also the way that it's kind of trying to evoke the values that people at home would have had, right, and the values that they would have celebrated. What passing bell for these who die as cattle? Only the monstrous anger of the guns. Only the stuttering rifle's rapid rattle can patter out their hasty orisons. No mockeries now for them, no prayers nor bells, nor any voice of mourning, save the choirs, the shrill, demented choirs of wailing shells, and bugles calling for them from sad shires. What candles may be held to speed them all? Not in the hands of boys, but in their eyes shall shine the holy glimmers of goodbyes. The pallor of girls' brows shall be their pall, their flowers the tenderness of patient minds, and each slow dusk a drawing down of blinds. So this poem's kind of interesting in the way that the two stanzas sort of set up the contrast between the battlefield and the home front, what's happening at home. So you have in the front, in the first stanza, a little bit of the noise and the chaos of warfare. There's not prayer, there's not bells. Instead, there's the wailing of shells, which aren't a church choir, but a demented choir. The bells don't celebrate people, right? They only have monstrous anger. So he's purposely, I think, trying to draw that contrast between the expectations of people at home and how they might want to see things portrayed, and instead what he found in the trenches. And then specifically in the second stanza, I think he's purposely drawing quite a few religious allusions out, right? That you had the prayers or the bells in the first, but you have the holy glimmers of goodbyes. You have the funeral imagery, and then you have, I think, in that closing image, in the image of the family house of the blinds coming down each night, that acknowledgement that there's a loss at home, right? When these soldiers are lost, it's not just the soldiers who are suffering and their comrades, it's the families at home and the empty houses that will be part of that. So another thing that some of these poets do, Owen in particular, is to kind of consider these ideas and images that have been used as propaganda and to try to contradict them. So here's maybe one of the best known World War I poems, another of my favorites. I still remember in high school, my high school teacher reading this, and it just made the hair stand up on the back of my neck, and it usually still does. Bent double like old beggars under sacks, knock-kneed, coughing like hags, we cursed through sludge, till on the haunting flares we turned our backs, and towards our distant rest began to trudge. Men marched asleep. Many had lost their boots, but limped on, bloodshod. All went lame, all blind, drunk with fatigue, deaf even to the hoots of gas shells dropping softly behind. Gas, gas, quick boys, an ecstasy of fumbling, fitting the clumsy helmets just in time. But someone was still yelling out and stumbling, and floundering like a man in fire or lime. Dim through the misty panes and thick green light, as under a green sea, I saw him drowning. In all my dreams, before my helpless sight, he plunges at me, guttering, choking, drowning. If in some smothering dreams you too could pace behind the wagon that we flung him in, and watch the white eyes writhing in his face, his hanging face, like a devil's sick of sin, if you could hear at every jolt the blood come gargling from froth-corrupted lungs, obscene as cancer, bitter as the cud of vile, innumerable sores on innocent tongues, my friend, you would not tell with such high zest to children ardent for some desperate glory, the old lie, Dulce et Decorum Est, pro patria more. So the Latin phrase it's from the Roman poet Horace, and it means it is fitting, sweet and fitting to die for one's country. Besides kind of the brutal and graphic imagery of the man choking from a gas attack, I love in this one the way he reinforces it with the word choices, and you have some of these. It's hard to read out loud because he puts in so many G's and D's strung together to kind of, it almost evokes that choking that the guy is doing, right? Come gargling from froth-corrupted lungs. And then you have the hissing, obscene as cancer, sores on innocent tongues. There's all kinds of S sounds to kind of to evoke that hissing of the gas shells. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah, exactly. Right. And I think, that he wanted that contrast, right? It's and it's almost like it totally avoids the issue of those martial virtues, right? Were these guys courageous? Probably. Were they disciplined? Probably. But it's not even something that he's interested in at this point, right? That he wants our focus totally to be on the effects of it, right? To be the human experience of it, kind of that. Yeah, he was. He was an officer. Fought on the front lines for a while. He temporarily was sent to Edinburgh to deal with what they called shell shock, post-traumatic stress disorder, we'd call it today, and then went back, and he actually, I think I put the dates, that's a picture of him. He actually died a week before the armistice, November 4th of 1918, so he's kind of, so only 2 of these poems were published in his lifetime, but a fellow poet, Siegfried Sassoon, who's another really well-known World War I poet, met him at this hospital, actually, and edited and published his poems after the war. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah. That's good to know. It's yeah, and I'm sure those who were critical of Tennyson probably would have said something similar of him, right? Yeah, good. Any questions so far? All right. I want to leave time for questions at the end, but this was a painting by John Singer Sargent, who's a well-known painter, and he was commissioned by. Now I forget which government, if it was the British or American government, but he was commissioned to do war paintings and sent to, not the front itself, but the back lines, and this was one that to me, reminds me of the Owen poem. This is a close-up of the part on the right. So what I think my overall point would be that one of the big changes in the way war is portrayed in art is that you have, I think, the rise of what you can think of as anti-war art, right? That's some of these trench poets who are very critical of the way the war is conducted and critical of warfare, I think, are some of the original anti-war poets, and really that's the string, I think, that we have with us today that is new from World War I. So a favorite poet of Owen and Sassoon and many of these World War I poets was Thomas Hardy, and this is something he wrote before World I I think he was writing about the Boer War. And so the next few things I have are really some of the different characteristics that you find in anti-war art. I would say it's not just poetry, but even war films. If you look, you'll find these characteristics in anti-war films. So in addition to the ones that I was pointing out with Owen, you have a tendency to see the enemy as a comrade, for the soldier to see the enemy soldier as having much more in common with him than with the people back home, right, with the officers that are conducting the war. So this is what Hardy wrote. Had he and I but met by some old ancient inn, we should have sat us down to wet right many a nipperkin. But ranged as infantry and staring face to face, I shot at him as he at me and killed him in his place. I shot him dead because he was my foe, just so. My foe, of course he was, that's clear enough, although he thought he'd enlist, perhaps, offhand-like, just as I, was out of work, had sold his traps, no other reason why. Yes, quaint and curious war is. You shoot a fellow down, you'd treat, if met where any bar is, or help to half a crown. Okay, so, another common thing that you see is some attention to a feeling of the soldier in combat that there's a betrayal going on, a betrayal by folks at home. All right. Part of it is the culture at large, and maybe the values that they've been taught, the expectations they've been taught, but also often it's directed strictly at commanding officers, at the way a war is executed. In fact, Sassoon is kind of famous for the reason he was sent to the war hospital in the middle of the war was that he wrote a protest letter criticizing the generals and the way the war was being conducted, and had someone read it out at the House of Commons, and so the response was to send him to the hospital. So this is from Siegfried Sassoon called "They." And again, in a way, it has that two-part home and the front sequence, the way that Owen did. The bishop tells us, when the boys come back, they will not be the same, for they'll have fought in a just cause. They'll lead the last attack on Antichrist. Their comrades' blood has bought new right to breed an honorable race. They have challenged death and dared him face to face. We're none of us the same, the boys reply, for George lost both his legs and Bill's stone blind. Poor Jim's shot through the lungs and like to die, and Bert's gone syphilitic. You'll not find a chap who's served who hasn't found some change. And the bishop said, the ways of God are strange. So you have the bishop kind of giving the high-minded, noble version of what they're doing, kind of trying to inspire people at home, and then the contrasting reply of the boys who are serving. And this, it might be surprising to us today, but by far the most controversial word in this whole poem was syphilitic. This idea that the honorable soldiers would go out and not behave, honorably. Okay. And then some more general themes that you see, like I mentioned, the betrayal of leadership, the suffering at home, the way women, children, and family are affected by the loss of their loved ones. The idea of remembering the dead, but remembering them in a way that's very particular to the specific person, rather than as kind of these abstractions of the noble or the honorable or the glorious, right? And then attention to what happens to the soldier when they're back home, and how these experiences change people, as the poem says, but also it can be a longer-term wounding of sorts. So I want to just leave you with one last poem that's well known. It's a little less grim and bleak. It's called "In Flanders Field" by John McRae. In Flanders Field the poppies blow, between the crosses row on row, that mark our place, and in the sky the larks still bravely singing fly, scarce heard amid the guns below. We are the dead. Short days ago we lived, felt dawn, saw sunset glow, loved and were loved, and now we lie in Flanders fields. Take up our quarrel with the foe. To you from failing hands we throw the torch. Be yours to hold it high. If you break faith with us who die, we shall not sleep, though poppies grow in Flanders field. So I close with this one because it's easy to sort of overemphasize this switch into anti-war poetry, and really it's, I think, that both of these trends continue, right? And here you have one that I think is much more celebratory of the soldiers and the sacrifices they make. And you notice even in the last stanza, the torch, right? Again, passing on the torch, a sense of legacy. So what's interesting about this one is it was written by a Canadian officer, and that the story, it could just be apocryphal, is that he wrote it in haste on a sheet of paper. He didn't like it, and so he just left it when the unit moved on, but someone picked it up, and the people in his unit really liked it, and so they kept it, and it ended up being, obviously one of the more famous poems from this war. And I think that's it. So if I have my email up there, I'm happy to talk or answer questions now, or if you want to contact me some other time, I'm happy to talk about this. So are there any questions or things you'd want to add? Yeah.
Okay, let me come.
Oh.
I'm going to start here and move my way forward, okay?
There seems to be some correlation between the traditional sentiments of somebody like Brooke
Mm-hmm.
or Alan Seeger, I Have a Rendezvous with Death,
Mm-hmm.
by contrast with the technical innovations of the anti-war poets.
Mm-hmm.
Is there some sense that by virtue of declaring themselves against the war, they were also setting themselves up against the more standard poetic diction of the time?
Yeah, I hadn't really pointed that out, but yeah, that's exactly right. That stylistically, they make a conscious decision to get away from the rhyme, the rhythm, the pattern stanzas that we saw, I think, most clearly in Tennyson, right? That would kind of be the common or the acceptable, the privileged forms, right? And so, yeah, one of the ways to draw your attention to the fact that they're saying something new is to put it in a new form, to kind of to change the vehicle that it's presented in. Yeah, that's right.
How did ordinary people have access to these poems?
That's a good question. I think it actually, probably in the general population, took a while to filter back. And so typically in literary magazines is where you would first see these poems. I said that two of Owen's poems were published during his lifetime, and they were in a journal that was printed by this hospital, this war hospital. The Hydra, it was called. And Owen was the editor, and he wrote kind of a fiery editorial in one edition of it. So literary journals would be the first way, and then after the war, in the years after the war, survivors, family members, other artists started collecting and publishing them as books. And I always think that there's a lag time before the culture at large is maybe ready to think about them and kind of take on board the knowledge that these different poems were giving.
Okay.
Other questions?
I should stay in the middle, I think. This is silly.
Are you going to do a sequel on World War II?
I know even less about World War II. No, I would say it would be interesting, actually, because I think it's it's like if you say to most Americans the Great War, my guess is they think of World War II and not World War I. And I kind of think that that it's not until World War II that warfare has the same effect on the American psyche, or has a parallel influence.
You also have a lot of different media.
Yeah, yeah, exactly right. Yeah, the moving pictures becomes especially more important. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Are you going to do one on the poetry that the German soldiers?
Oh,
I wondered
I
about
haven't, but
their perspective on the war and how that was expressed in poetry.
yeah. I don't know about poetry. One of the more famous books to come out of World War I is All Quiet on the Western Front, which was written by a German veteran. Mm-hmm. And it introduces all those exact themes of the anti-war work of art, right? Seeing the enemy as the comrade, the German soldier is stuck in a foxhole with the French soldier that he kills, and he has this long conversation and reads the letters in his pocket and tries to, sees him as a fellow human being instead of the enemy. Mm-hmm.
More questions? Oh, yeah, sure.
I was wondering about Rupert Brooke, where he fits in here. You know, he's kind of, if I should die, think only this of me. There's a corner of some foreign field.
Yeah. He's a complicated one, right? Because he does take on a lot of these new characteristics of the war poet, but there is, I think, still some of that sentiment that remains, that what he's doing is honorable and is noble and has a purpose, right? I think in Owen there's such a sense of futility, right? That what are they doing? Trudging through mud, getting shot at. They're just existing and surviving. They're not fighting or pursuing any nobler cause. But with Brooke, I think he keeps that sense that there is something noble in what they're doing, despite the brutality of it. Yeah, that's a good good person to bring up. Yeah.
Any more questions?
There's another one next.
Over here.
Yeah, there was an important change in firepower
Mm-hmm.
during World War I, the machine gun
Yeah.
and the rapid fire Enfield.
Mm-hmm.
And so the casualty rate, that's why they were driven underground, that is into trenches,
Yeah.
because of the Germans had the maximum machine gun, which just, plus the rapid fire
Yeah.
rifles.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that change in industry and change in technology is such an important part of how.
So it drove them into trenches and dugouts.
Yeah. I was reading something recently about kind of about a myth of World War II, at least, or World War I, according to the BBC, anyways. But this idea that the leadership was incompetent, but one of the things they were pointing out is that there technologically there had been nothing like this before, and that a typical means of attack when there's a massive machine guns is pointless, right? And so the technology sort of drove them to tactical changes like trenches and the systems of trenches that they worked in. Mm-hmm.
So I think we'll leave our Q&A there. But if anyone else has questions for Dr. McGuigan, you can certainly come up and ask him. But thank you all for joining me, and let's thank Dr. McGuigan today.
Thanks.
Thank you.